Hello and welcome to our first May Ziadeh Literary Salon and Book Pre-Launch event, an echo of and tribute to May's early 20th century Tuesday salons. Our English language edition of May's Musings of a Young Woman, set for release this October, will be the first book-length translation of May's work published in English. The book comes as the second in our Erased Not Forgotten series, which began with a collection of short stories by Semira Azam, encouraged by Adania Shibli. The idea behind the series is to forge new connections between contemporary readers and writers and books from the past, sparking new engagement with work by writers who were marginalized from the literary canon in one way or another. So please do ask questions at any point in the chat. And it also, and thank you for Osama and Nada for saying hello. Possibly they already know. I really enjoy if people say where they are in these kind of chats. It's always nice to hear where people are coming in from. And of course, any comments and questions are welcome at any point. We're going to start with an introduction to this whole project from Ibtihal. Ibtihal Rida Mahmood is a writer, editor, translator, and poet. She's the translator and co-editor of Snow in Amman, an anthology of short stories from Jordan, and the English translator of Yassin Ahajsalah's The Impossible Revolution, Making Sense of the Syrian Tragedy. She's a contributing editor of ArabLit, and in particular, the managing editor of this book, Musings of a Young Woman, here to give us a brief introduction to May and her musings. So thank you, Ibtihal, for starting us off.
Thank you, Marcia. Thank you. That was lovely. So good morning, good evening, everybody, wherever you are in the world. Can you hear me, first of all? All right. So I'm going to start with a short biography of May Ziadeh. So she, as you all know, she was a pioneer poet, essayist, translator, and feminist who stood at the vanguard of the Nahda, the Arab Renaissance. She was born in 1886 in Nazareth, Palestine, to a Lebanese father and Palestinian mother. She was multilingual. Oh my goodness, she spoke French, German, Italian, Spanish, and English before choosing Arabic as her true literary home. She studied in Lebanon, and she later moved to Cairo, where she matured intellectually. And she also balanced a prolific career in education and publishing, and she wrote widely for prominent journals like Al-Hilal and Al-Mahrusa, which was actually published by her father, Ilyas Ziadeh. And she also hosted a literary salon, which shaped the era's intellectual landscape. And in 1922, she became the first woman to lecture at the American University of Beirut. So between 1928 and 1932, she suffered a series of devastating personal crises, and a lot of you probably know about her institutionalization. Between 1928 and 1932, that's the time when she lost her parents, and also she heard about the passing of Khalil Gibran, and she was extremely depressed, and she isolated herself. Like she was already she wasn't very social to begin with, and those events sort of like exasperated her need for isolation, and that propelled her family members to institutionalize her, sadly. But eventually, she was able to get out of the mental institution she was forced to stay in, and she returned to Cairo, where she spent the remainder of her life. And her last lecture was in 1941, in January of that year, and it was titled Live Dangerously, before she passed away later that year. And there was also a little detail that I came across when I was a child. I got my first introduction to May Ziadeh. I read a little detail about her introduction to, like, how she chose Arabic to be her language of choice to write in. So An Egyptian anti-colonial intellectual named Ahmad Lutfi Sayyid actually gifted her a copy of the Quran to improve her mastery of classical Arabic. I just wanted to throw that in there. Uh, and so for all of those accomplishments, what I love particularly about Musings of a Young Woman is that it introduces us to May Ziadeh before she became a literary icon. It was written between 1911 and 1921, so this text follows a young May Ziadeh as she claimed her space. We're simply following a brilliant young woman thinking out loud, and that's what really these musings are. They're reflections, observations, questions, flashes of insight, moments of wonder, moments of self-discovery, moments of irritation even sometimes. So reading them feels less like sitting down with a historical monument and more like joining on some ongoing conversation. And what really struck me most when I first encountered these pieces was how contemporary they felt also. So you would expect to hear a voice from early 20th century, but instead you keep finding someone asking questions that still feel alive today. Questions like, how do we become ourselves? How do we remain intellectually curious? How do we participate in society without losing our individuality? How do we carve out space for our own thoughts in a world full of expectations? And she asks these questions with elegance and humor and intelligence and openness, which makes the book feel surprisingly intimate. And I want to say something about the title. So I think the title is perfect because Musings suggests movement. So rather than being like finished conclusions, I feel like these musings are thoughts unfolding in real time. So you can almost watch her mind at work as she tests ideas and revisits some of the assumptions about women writing, and follows her curiosity whatever it leads. And that's one of the reasons I'm so excited about this translation, is that many readers probably know May Ziadeh's name, but a lot of them, of course, know about her being a prominent figure in the Nahda. They know about her correspondence with Gibran Khalil Gibran, but far fewer have had the chance to spend some time with her, like like a sort of like having a one-on-one conversation with the writer, in a like a quiet corner, so to speak. So this book gives us that opportunity. It allows us to encounter her not simply as an important historical figure, but also as a living presence on the page. She's curious, she's perceptive, she's questioning, she's wonderfully engaging. And so if you're joining us today without knowing much about May Ziadeh, you're in for a treat. But if you already know her, I think you'll discover dimensions of her writing that feel fresh and unexpected.
Thank you so much, Ibtihal, for that introduction to May Ziadeh. We're gonna start actually before Musings, before when she wrote in, she began writing in French. And it was 1911, at the age of 25, when she published her first collection of poetry, Fleurs de Rêve, under the pseudonym Isis Copia. I have no idea how she pronounced it. But there are poems that continue to echo powerfully today. The poet and teacher Rose DeMaris has made a particular project of translating these early poems by May Ziadeh. Although she couldn't join us today, she did record herself reciting one of the poems. So I'm going to play that now.
Goodbye, Lebanese mountains.
Well, no, I should play it from the beginning, actually.
Wait,
Okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rose DeMaris. I'm a poet, and I have been slowly working on making English language translations of the French language poems that May wrote in her adolescence and early 20s. One of those poems she wrote at the age of 23 when she emigrated from Lebanon to Cairo, Egypt with her parents. And that's what I'm going to be sharing with you today. May titled this poem Adieu, and the translation is called Goodbye, Lebanon. I feel that it probably would have been impossible for May to have imagined at the time when she wrote this poem, circa 1910, what kind of contemporary relevance it would have at this moment in time. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye, Lebanon. Goodbye, Lebanese mountains. I'm going far from your pink rose garlands, your bright red satin strawberries. Egypt called in a serious voice, and already my boat's rocking bears new fruit. But see, whisper your lullabies, please, because I hurt so much. Soft waves of home, sob for me. Don't vanish so all wound. Holy tender, Lebanon, you made me. Your moody nights put the darkness in my eyes and laid a vein of lightning in my soul. Your white lace waterfalls wove jasmine vines and oud serenades all through me. And my speech is the spirit murmuring in your woods. All my undulance is yours. Sometimes my soul is wild, an egret flying far beyond the ocean's edge. And sometimes I curl up, tender as a feather moss when touched, as yielding and as damp. Now your outline fades. Your land is like a reverie that ends, but grief goes on. Goodbye, my nest. I adore you, Lebanon. My heart, pink roses, red strawberries, turns to vapor with the word goodbye. Thank you so much. Thank you, Marcia, for inviting me to participate in this salon. It's a real honor, and I am so excited about the new book and so full of gratitude and admiration for those of you who have helped to bring it into being. And I really hope that I can watch a recording of this gathering after the fact so that I can get to know all of you and your work a little bit. Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Okay, so thank you to Rose for sharing that, and there's more poems that people can read if they want at ArabLit.org. Next, I want to introduce Dana El-Shahbari, who is the sort of the muse of this entire project, who wrote the foreword and is the impetus behind this book. She's a PhD researcher at the University of Cambridge, specializing in the Nahda, its intellectual history, and Arab women's writing. Her research focuses particularly on the recovery of May Ziadeh through scholarship and archival work, and she's going to talk with us about her research today. So please, over to you.
Thank you so much, Marcia, for this kind introduction, and thank you all for gathering here today across different time zones and cities as we celebrate the translation of May Ziadeh's Musings of a Young Woman. It really feels fitting that a conversation about Ziadeh should begin in a space of gathering, as so much of her intellectual life unfolded through acts of encounter, whether it's in salons, in letters, newspapers, lectures, and conversations that moved between Cairo, Beirut, Damascus, and beyond to the Mahjar. My own journey with Ziadeh began during my master's degree at the American University of Beirut in 2022, when I worked on a comparative study of her and Virginia Woolf. At first, the parallels between the writers seemed very compelling to me, but not, unfortunately, their respective legacies. Both were contemporary to each other, were women thinking about what it meant for a woman to write in the early 20th century. Both participated in influential literary circles, Woolf in Bloomsbury and Ziadeh in her Tuesday Literary Salon, which, as Ibtihal has mentioned, she founded and ran for almost 20 years. Both also experimented with form and voice, and both make us question about the politics of madness and women in history. However, the more I read about Ziadeh and the more I read about Ziadeh's expansive body of work, the more I felt there was a much larger project waiting to be done, and a scholarly need to read her within the world she inhabited and helped shape, meaning the Nahda, Cairo's press and salons, within her intellectual conversations with Arab writers and thinkers, both men and women, and within the longer history of Arab women's writing. This drive is, of course, shaped by realization many of us who translated this book today and who work with Ziadeh's literature more generally know very well. That is Ziadeh's presence as an image, as a symbol of something, of women's renaissance, of feminism, as a well-known name, but her life has often been sensationalized at the expense of her intellectual legacy. And hence there's this necessity to move away from such reductive tropes and return to her writings, which stand at the crosspoint of many schools of thought, including Romanticism, literary criticism, and life writing, which I closely work with in my project. One of the challenges, I would say, but also the pleasures of working with Ziadeh is the richness of her voice. Its layered voice that shifts between irony and satire, assertiveness and vulnerability. It's a poetic voice that is very intimate at times, but also very collective and public at others. I became especially interested in this voice and the way she curates her different selves across different forms of writing. Now, this, of course, stands in opposition to the reception of some contemporaries for Ziadeh, and I give here the example of Mahmoud Abbas al-Akkad, who describes Ziadeh's voice as neutral. There's nothing that makes you angry if you read Ziadeh's writings, he says. And I remember being shocked by this claim for a number of reasons. But most importantly, because to claim a voice is neutral is to strip away its agency. And it's only in returning to Ziadeh's feminist voice in her literature that we can see and read her in a different light, and more importantly, in a more critical manner. Now, this brings me to Sawanih Fatat, or the Musings of a Young Woman, which gradually emerged as a center of gravity in my PhD research because it's her most experimental work in terms of form, and it's among the most expansive in the range of themes it covers. It's a work that's difficult to classify as it moves between essay, memoir, literary criticism, poetry, short story, travel literature, and even a microplay. And while all these genres have evolved and taken clearer contours and more defined features in Arab literary history, it's still important to acknowledge their presence and their roots in Sawanih Fatat. So to follow on Ibtihal's comment on the title, the singular form of Sawanih in Arabic carries a dual meaning. So it means fikra or thought, and then fursa, an opportunity. This is something I reflect on in the book's introduction, and I feel like it's important to bring it here in this discussion about Ziadeh's literary voice. Through this deliberate wordplay, Ziadeh positions her book as a modest collection of thoughts coming from a young woman. Yet this modesty surprises readers who, from the first musing and even the first page, discover a book that asks much larger questions about gender, literature, and cultural production during the Nahda. I look at Sawanih and my work as a record that invites us into an Arab woman's journey of becoming a writer, especially as she enters male-dominated publishing spaces in turbulent times of World War I and the rise of national aspirations in Egypt. What new spaces did women come to inhabit? And how did the boundaries of private and public shift at the turn of the century? How was women's literature received, and who assumed literary authority? In السانحة الأولى, that is the first musing of the book, Ziadeh affirms women's writing, but also with it the double-edged reception of approaching this literature with curiosity to know the common female self, to use her own words, but also how this literature is dismissed and denied serious engagements as readers leaf through its pages. Now, this statement or characterization, positioned in the first page of the book, further calls us to question the politics of reading women's literature and to engage more seriously with it then and now. More on the question of woman emerges in the story of a woman who has a story. حكاية السيدة التي لها حكاية. Another musing in the book, which I had the pleasure of translating, where Ziadeh critiques the societal obsession with women's lives and also asks us to think about who has the right to weave these stories and narratives and narrate them. With it, to question the structures of storytelling. Elsewhere in the memory of Baalbek's citadel, Ziadeh stands before the ruins of Baalbek and transforms the Jahili motif of al-Wuquf ala al-Atlal, or standing before the ruins, into a meditation on history, colonialism, memory, and cultural inheritance. Reading this piece today, amid the genocide in Gaza and Israel's war in Lebanon, and specifically its attacks on cultural sites of Sur and Baalbek, it becomes difficult not to feel the continued urgency of Ziadeh's reflections on loss, resistance, and cultural memory from a century ago. In Musings pages, we also meet Ziadeh in many, many rooms. We meet her in Cairo University, among the first generations of women to enter its classrooms, and she there reflects on knowledge while war trembles outside. We meet her as a critic of language, thinking as a prolific woman of letters herself about Arabic correspondence and the changing nature of literary expression and style from Al-Mutanabbi's time to the Nahda. We also meet her at the writing desk, where the private self is never entirely private, because the woman writer, she tells us, is always conscious of being watched and interpreted by the patriarchal gaze. For all these reasons and so much more, this translation of Sawanih Fatat matters. It's about creating new conditions for a different encounter with Ziadeh that's not grounded in mythologized narratives that have long overshadowed her thought and legacy. Instead, it opens doors for reading the complexity and intellectual ambition of her writing in this unique and genre-defying form of musings. I think I will end with this note. Thank you for listening, and Marsha, Ibtihal, Minan, and all the translators. It's really been a pleasure to work with you on this project.
Thank you so much. And I think since two people now have remarked upon the title, I think I should admit that it was me who who first brought that idea to the group, saying, is really Musings of a Young Woman as an English translation going to work as a translated title? Isn't Musings sound too light, too frivolous? And basically, I think I was pounced on by just about everyone, and told told that I was wrong. But yeah, Dana, if you want to talk just a little bit more about the title and how the window it provides into the whole kind of process, the whole book.
Well, I think the title, what I like about the title is the element of surprise in it, right? Because you're right to point out that maybe when someone reads the title and it's Musings of a Young Woman, they would, think they're reading a memoir or maybe like a few reflections. But then, like, the first musing, السانحة الأولى, is a feminist manifesto on women's writing. Then we go into ذكرى قلعة بالبك. We have the poem أحرصي على قلبك, which Marilyn Booth has translated. And I think, it's this element of surprise that makes this very special, because it will take the reader, it will take them the fact that they have to open the book and see what's inside these musings. And again, it's like this idea of openings that Ibtihal has mentioned. It's a fursa, it's an opportunity. It's thoughts that then unleash in Ziadeh's life as a young woman herself. So yeah, I think the reader has to wait and see, I would say.
We do have the opportunity of Marilyn Booth being with us today. And so I thought I would just briefly introduce Marilyn, who is an emerita professor at University of Oxford. She researches 19th century Arabophone women's writing and early Arab feminisms, as well as historical translation, especially concerning gender polemics. Particularly relevant to everyone here today, Marilyn's most recent translation, I believe, unless there's been another one published since March, is Alyssa Bustani's 1891 novel, Sa'iba, out now from Oxford University Press. And so we would love it, Marilyn, if you could talk a little bit about how you first came to know May's work, its significance in her time, and its ongoing resonance, which I think all of us have grappled with in some way.
Great. Thank you very much, Marcia and everybody. It's been a real pleasure to be part of this. You can hear me, right? Okay. It's been a real pleasure to be part of this project, and I'm looking forward to seeing the final book. And I love the fact that it's a collective effort, that we've all worked together on it. I think that's very much within the spirit of the kind of work that May Ziadeh did, and many other women as well. I first encountered May Ziadeh when I was an undergraduate. I was studying Arabic, and I guess just in my reading, I found her and I was absolutely fascinated, and I ended up writing an undergraduate honors dissertation on her. And what I focused on, and I was especially fascinated by, were her biographies, that biographical critical studies of other female authors, and the way that she used those. They were real. Taimur, whom I've also done some work on since, and Melek Hefni Nasif, whom I'm actually working on right now. And I really liked the way that these were works that really appreciated and treated these women's lives and works in a very sensitive manner, but where they also allowed May to place herself within a kind of female and feminist genealogy of women. And so that's what I focused on then. And it also meant that that was really my first encounter with literary translation. And I'm not sure I would recommend starting out your career as a literary translator with May Ziadeh. She's very difficult, very layered, as others have said, very eloquent. But it certainly helped my Arabic to work on her. But I retained an interest in her and went back to work on her a bit later on, looking more at her work as autobiography. And as Ibtihal and Dana have said, this is Musings of a Young Woman, is a multifaceted, multi-generic text, but I do think it's a really interesting work as if one thinks about it as a work of autobiography. And the title, Sawaneh Fatet, I have found a couple of other uses of Sawaneh in works by women of that period. And I think what it does, it operates as a kind of possibly autobiographical signal, and yet it's a rather tentative one. It isn't saying I'm presenting you with a memoir. It's, these are my thoughts. So I think it's a very canny way of approaching autobiography. And I wouldn't want to overread, because again, as my colleagues have said, there are many things going on in this text. But I do think in some of the Sawaneh, there's a kind of mirroring going on, where she's talking to the audience. She's talking in some cases to or about a female interlocutor, but she's also talking to herself. She's addressing herself. And so I find that play of voices really, really fascinating. And it was wonderful to come back after this long period of time and retranslate the poem that I translated and the other text I translated, and to sort of rethink. And I did change my earlier translation quite a bit. But I believe, Marcia, that in the volume is going to include a short sort of excerpt from a much longer article that I wrote about May Ziadeh in terms of trying to think about her and other women autobiographically. So yeah, this is great. And I guess I would hope that we might continue with trying to translate some more of her work, because she obviously deserves a lot of attention. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Marilyn. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here today.
Pleasure.
So Layla, you're next. And I want to introduce Layla AlAmmar as a translator, but also and a scholar, but also as a novelist. She currently teaches at American University of Kuwait, although is now done for the semester. Her debut novel, The Pact We Made, was nominated for the Authors Club Best First Novel Award, while Silence is a Sense was shortlisted for the William Sarayan International Prize for Writing. So, Layla, we would love to hear you read both from the original and from your translation, but also if we could start off by you talking a little bit about why you wanted to be involved in this project.
Thanks, Marcia, and thanks for having me. Yeah, I guess for me it was about, I had been sort of immersed in May's work for a really long time, and as I'm sure most of you would agree, is, atrociously underserved in translation, which is not an unusual story. Let's be frank. Plenty of Arab women are underserved by translation, and so I wanted to participate in this to kind of just lend my voice and my understanding of her and her writing that I've been sitting with for so many years. And I was spending this past week trying to remember where I first came across her and her work, or even just her name. Um, and it's one of those things where you're so familiar with someone's writing and with someone's life that you don't even remember really where you first came across. But I think, to the best of my recollection, it was actually in Nawal Saadawi's book, الوجه العاري للمرأة العربية, The Naked Face of the Arab Woman, which was horribly, strangely retitled as The Hidden Face of Eve. So I don't know if this part, or like the 2 pages that she devotes to May in this entire book, made it into the translation, because I haven't read it. But in this book, Nawal gives her 2 pages. That's it. And it's kind of folded into this larger chapter about the rise of feminist consciousness in Egypt. And so it's folded into talks about Qasim Amin and Huda Sha'rawi and Aisha Taymouriya and all of those. But her kind of portrait of May is very much this symbol that Dana was talking about earlier, where it's just, there's literally a tiny little paragraph about her, how erudite she was, and how, her salon was this kind of meeting place of intellectuals, and how she wrote, so profoundly about so many different topics. 1 paragraph, tiny paragraph. And then the other 2 pages were devoted to, her melancholy and her sensitive nature and her romance, her unrequited romance, which Nawal says that she was involved with Abbas al-Aqad and not Khalil Gibran. So it's just this very kind of, but the brushstrokes are all the same. It's like this unrequited love, this melancholy woman who had mental health issues and was institutionalized, and I remember thinking there's got to be more than just that. Like it's so bare, like there's nothing there. And then you get into May's work herself, and it's just this unending just treasure trove of knowledge and thought. So yeah, I wanted to participate in kind of bringing more of her to light. So I'm very happy to be part of this project. Thank you.
Thanks, Layla. And so you want to read a bit from the one you translate?
Yeah. So shall I do the original
Yes,
Arabic and then the English? Okay, so I'll just do kind of the opening bit. It's chapter 13 called دنا عيد الميلاد. دنا عيد الميلاد وجاءت معه جميع الذكريات والتصورات والمعاني الخاصة به. غدا يلقي الواعظون من على المنابر كلمات الرفق والإحسان والغفران، وينشد المنشدون المجد لله في العلا وعلى الأرض السلام، فيسمع الناس الأناشيد والمواعظ ولا يحاولون إدراك كنهها، وإن أدركوا فلا يعتقدون بوجوب تطبيقها على أعمالهم، لأنها كجميع النصائح تقل قيمتها بالتكرار ويستخف بها كلما تبرع بها المتبرعون. المجد لله ليس في العلا الذي لا نعلم ما هو فحسب، بل المجد له في كل مكان وكل زمان. أما السلام فليس على الأرض في أيامنا، ولا ينتظر أن يحلوا عليها قبل أن يتغير نظام الكون، وهو التصارع والتقاتل الذي لا يفتر ولا يضعف. So it's a very kind of appropriate kind of evaluation of the world. So in English, it's Christmas has come. Christmas has come, heralding all the memories, images, and meanings we associate with it. Tomorrow, preachers will stand at their pulpits and deliver words of kindness, charity, and forgiveness. Choirs will sing, "Glory to God on high and peace on earth." The people will listen to these sermons and hymns without really comprehending their meaning. And if they do grasp their essence, they will not think it ought to be applied to their own actions. For those words, like all suggestions and advice, lose their value with repetition and are increasingly trivialized the more that they are offered. Glory is to God, not only on high, which is beyond our knowledge, but glory is to him everywhere and at all times. As for peace, it is not on earth, nor in our times, and we cannot expect to see it so long as the system is one of incessant and unabating conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the whole scope of things, Mai is not very distant from us. We're
No.
sort of primed to think of, oh, women from, who were born in their early, or rather the late
1886.
late
Yeah.
1800s. That's so far away, and
Yeah.
yet nearly everything about her time seems from the the trivialization of her as a woman and by critics to exactly the to migration to her thoughts on colonial occupation and war feels so immediate.
Yeah, and I'm not sure exactly when this chapter was written. I don't know, maybe Dana knows for sure, but I mean, I imagine that she's talking about the war period during this time. Maybe it was the First World War. So
Must be around
it's
that time,
so
yeah.
I would think it's
She
around
writes
that
at the end of
time.
some articles like this was written in the late 1911s or so on, but I don't think she's specified Eid al-Milad. Yeah.
Yeah. So, considering where things are now, it's a kind of fitting words, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So we have, before we kind of move on to the discussion, one more speaker, which is Qualey Bordewich. Qualey, I hope you're there, is a Montreal-based researcher, writer, editor, and translator focused on the history of information and the politics of historical narrative in the Eastern Mediterranean. And Qualey, sort of the same question to you as a historian, why or not as a historian, as however you wanted to, why you wanted to participate in this as well, and if you could also read from your translation.
Yeah, thank you so much. As others have said, it's really a rare privilege to be part of such a truly collective project. That's very rare in among historians, and also rare, I think, among translators, at least to this degree. So this has been a new and really rewarding experience for me. So I came to May Ziadeh from two different angles as a historian. One is that my focus is on early 20th century Egypt. And of course, she looms large. And the other is that I'm the co-founder of the Boston Little Syria Project. And Khalil Gibran is sort of the hometown favorite who grew up in the turn of the 20th century in Boston. And she, in his orbit, of course, is in some ways a sort of secondary character. And I felt that I really wanted to know herself much better. What is exciting to me, among the many things I think that's exciting to me as a historian working on this project, is that the moment that she's writing in is such an important historical moment. And so many of the voices we have from this moment, at least the ones that get reprinted and that get read, are male voices, particularly those commenting on current events, on the war, on on politics. And so I think that the five essays I translated, they were all directly engaging with current events. And I think I found that really new and fresh, actually, because we do often rely so much on male voices. She herself was so, I was struck in reading these essays of how engaged she was with so many different places in the world at once. And there was so much happening, just before, during, and after World War I, in the region where she was living, but she was also looking much beyond it. And I made a quick note that in the five essays I translated, she talked about Ireland, about Greece, about the United States, about Romania. So she was reading so widely and thinking about, how the transformations and the upheaval in all of these different places were related, and in some ways. And indeed, in Egypt, during Egypt's 1919 revolution, there was a lot of interest in Ireland, and the Irish anti-colonial movement. And so we see in one of the essays I translated on Terence McSwiney, where she talks about an Irish hunger striker who died in 1920, as part of the anti-British, anti-colonial movement. So that's something that I think perhaps deserves to be noted more in her work. Also, the sense that I was struck by how her voice in talking about these events is so human focused, so human centered. So she thinks, for example, she reflects on, King Constantine of Greece, for example. What was he thinking when he died by a monkey bite, for example, and what happened what was going on in Greek politics, and what were these different figures what was going on inside their minds, not only kind of trying to think about big geopolitical processes. And so it's just very, very human. So I was going to read from a different piece today, not from either of those. This is a piece called To Mr. BR. And in two of the essays I translated for this volume, May is wading into a transnational debate over about World War I, and about the kind of simplistic and moralizing and often sort of patronizing discourse that was going on between male commentators on the war, particularly about the way that religion had been weaponized in debates over the justifications of the war, but also the American isolationist stance. And so that's the context of this piece. And I thought I would read first from the Arabic briefly, and then I'll read from the English as well. Great. Okay. So yes, as I said, it's called To Mr. BR. إلى حضرتي بيراء. Okay. إن الأديان لا تبرأ من فظائع الحروب، ولا تجاوز إلا الدفاع عن الوطن إذا هاجمه الأعداء. ولكن جميع النفوس لا تفهم الأديان كما هي، بل كل منا يفهم دينه حسب درجة عقله وميول قلبه. ولا يقتصر البشر على الإيمان بالعقائد الدينية الأساسية، بل يتعصبون لاعتقادات أخرى إضافية لم تكن إلا اختراع التعصب والجهل. وكثيرا ما يستفيد رؤساء الشعب والحكومات من هذا التعصب، فيشهرون الحروب ويقودون الشعب المسكين إلى حيث لا أثر للدين ولا منفعة لغير السياسة. فإن استعمل الألمان وسواهم العلم وبذلوا كل ما لديهم من معرفة وحيلة في سبيل قهر أعدائهم، فهل هذا يعيب العلم؟ الطب عائد بالخير على الإنسانية، فهل إذا دس الطبيب لعليله السم لغرض من الأغراض فسدت منفعة الطب ووجب علينا أن نحسبه من حيث طبيعته شرا؟ هذا العلم الذي هو آلة شر وفناء في يد ألمانيا وغيرها الآن، كان وما زال آلة خير وحياة في يد ألوف من الأفراد وعشرات من الشعوب. لذلك لا يتحتم أن يكون المؤمن جاهلا، فالدين شيء والعلم شيء آخر. الدين مهذب شخصياتنا المعنوية والعلم ضرورة من ضروريات حياتنا. هذا للزمان وذاك للأبدية وليس لأحدهما أن يلاشي الآخر. So now I'm going to read from the English. Of course, religions themselves are innocent of the horrors of war, permitting only defense of the nation when it's under enemy attack. But most people do not understand religions as they actually are. Rather, everyone understands their religion according to their own level of knowledge and personal inclinations. We do not limit ourselves to faith in our religion's fundamental doctrines, but rather cling to other beliefs that are no more than the inventions of ignorance and fanaticism. Popular leaders and heads of state often benefit from this fanaticism, declaring wars and leading their poor subjects somewhere that is merely politically advantageous and has nothing to do with religion. If the Germans and their like have used science to vanquish their enemies, giving their utmost in both knowledge and subterfuge, is this the fault of science? Medicine serves humanity. If the doctor gives his patient poison for some reason or other, does that negate the benefits of medicine and demand that we define it as essentially evil? This science, which is at present an instrument of evil and death in the hands of Germany and others, was and still is an instrument of life and good in the hands of countless individuals and dozens of peoples. The believer must not be ignorant. Science is one thing and religion another. Religion edifies us as spiritual beings, while science is among the necessities of our lives. One is for the here and now, the other for eternity. The embrace of one need not mean the suppression of the other. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Chloe. I really appreciate that. So want to move on to kind of a discussion about all these things. And I guess one of the things that that all of this, as Layla and I were just saying a little bit ago, is how the extent to which the concerns that Maya's writing about mirror the concerns that are very present in the world today. And I guess when I was first thinking about why we want to publish May Ziadeh now in translation, I was thinking a lot about it in terms of what we owe her, which is a somewhat, I think, strange direction to come at it from. But we speak a lot about May Ziadeh. We use her as an icon. We speak about her letters with Khalil Gibran, but without creating space for her words. I do think, now as I'm listening to this, that also thinking through the same issues, but with an intelligent interlocutor from 100 years ago, is also a very kind of productive way to be thinking as well. And I guess I wondered what other people thought about why do we need, and not just in whether it's in translation or whether it's in the original Arabic, but why do we want to keep May Ziadeh as an interlocutor rather than just everybody, of course there are contemporary women who are also very powerful thinkers, but what does it mean to think across this century? And that's like to anybody who wants to answer, or if nobody does, then I guess I'll have to point at someone.
I think I can share my perspective on that. Because, whenever someone asks me about my work on May Ziadeh and why May, there's this conversation with Iman Mirsal that comes to mind when she says that, the plan and the purpose is not to prove that good Arab women writers exist. And I think that's exactly where I'm coming from as well. But it's more to think about the conditions that made Ziadeh's writing possible, but also the conditions that constrained this writing, and to reflect on the change of women's literature, Arab women's literature between the 20th century and then now. So I think, as you said, it's a very productive lens to look at literature, but also what changed, what remained the same, how's the publishing scene changing, what did she think about writing at the time? What did writing mean? So I think this is the lens that I come to approach May Ziadeh's literature. And I also like to think about her literature and conversation with other people, including, by the way, Gibran Khalil Gibran. Because I think the problem with this relationship between May and Gibran, as Chloe mentioned, is like she's always secondary to him. But then if we look at the same letters, and it's an expansive corpus of letters from an intellectual perspective, looking at the conversations they had, their romanticism and how they thought about, the emerging romantic voice in the early 20th century, the conversation shifts. And I think, it's how we approach these letters that makes a difference.
Yeah, go ahead.
You go
Marilyn.
ahead. Go ahead. You go ahead. Go ahead, Layla.
No, I was just going to say that for me, in thinking about this past century, I've been in my research and also in my creative work have been kind of going over this idea of kind of tracking what women have said over the last 100 years and looking at, these kinds of threads of critically targeting and identifying the same problem over and over again. And it was something that I kind of worked my way backwards, starting with Rida Samman, who everybody knows is like, for me, an icon of Arab women's writing, but then kind of working my way back through like Arwa Saleh's discussions of, the collapse of the Egyptian Marxist movement, and then further back and thinking about Latifa Zayat, and then getting back to May Ziadeh. And then for me, I was I found myself with her in her biographical sketch of Malek Hafni Nasif, Bahthat al-Badia, and just seeing the way that these two women talk to each other and their conversations about what they called the faux Nahda, this idea that the Nahda itself had taken on this fake aspect or this kind of facade or veneer of modernity in the way that it was talking about women's rights, its obsession with the veiling issue, all of these different debates that they were talking about: religion, marriage, polygamy, the rights of women to education, the importance of education, the importance of women knowing what their legal rights are. All of these, just getting into the nitty-gritty of what was going wrong at that moment. And that was such a pivotal moment, not only for Egypt, but for the entire Arab world. You're coming out of World War I. It's the end of the age of empire, this idea of nations and self-determination and self-governance, which Arabs took very seriously at that time. And so to have these women talking about, well, what is our role as women in this new nation that we are helping to create? Because these women were on the streets, they were participating in the revolts, they were participating in the boycotts against the British. They had a very active, very celebrated role in this in the revolution in 1919. And not only in Egypt, but all across the Arab world, like I said. And so, it was very interesting to me to see the issues, the problems that they were identifying at this moment in time. May Ziadeh wrote a letter to Ahmed Lutfi Sayyid saying, well, when they held the memorial for Saad Zaghloul's brother, Fethi Zaghloul, and they didn't allow women to come. And she writes a letter to Ahmed Lutfi Sayyid saying, why aren't women allowed to come to this event? And he brings up, the segregation of the sexes in funeral mourning rituals in Islam, which is true. But then it's also like, well, you're building this nation, this new nation. What are we building it on? Are we going to carry over these traditions? Or are we trying to do something new here? And so just seeing how those important snags in the Nahda project were already being talked about then. And all of that is so often overlooked, like we said, because of the drama of her later life or the drama of the romance. So that kind of intellectual dialogue is really, for me, what's so important in figuring out how the Nahda project went so very wrong.
Marilyn, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was actually going to say something very similar to what Layla has said, probably more eloquently than I would have said it. But precisely the way in which May Ziadeh was so engaged in the issues of her time and worked with other women. And I think, you know, her correspondence with and friendship with Malek Hifni Nassif is one aspect of that, but there were also others. And again, yeah, I mean, as Layla and others have said, I mean, that tends to get lost sometimes because there's all the fascination with not just Gibran, but and Al-Qad and, you know, the men. I remember when I was first working on her and I was trying to see what had been written in Arabic on her, and it seemed to mostly be books about kind of the men around May Ziadeh, you know. And so it's really great that we are now, you know, and have for some time. I mean, there's been a lot of work since, of course, really focusing on kind of other circles. And I think that that's a very important part of her work. She was involved in some of the early women's discussion circles that led eventually to the Feminist Union. And so, yeah, trying to put her into that context, I think is very, very important, and just great to do.
I mean, I just want to say, as a sort of a non-scholar and non-specialist, that to me also, Dana brought up Imen Marcel and her sort of important work recovering some writing by women writers of previous generations. That as I read those, as I read Imen engaging with previous writers, and as I read these women from earlier generations whose lives are so identifiable, whose lives to me feel so present and like they have the same concerns as me, when at some point in my life, I think I believed that, you know, feminism had kind of moved forward. And so why would I need to know what somebody thought 100 years ago? That it, you know, their engagement with these similar issues somehow made me feel more real about my own engagement with them. And so for me, that's one of the things that reading across these 100 years brings that contemporary writing doesn't. So unless somebody else wants to speak to that, Huda Shawa asked in one of the comments, she wondered if any of you guys have the first edition, it has come across the first edition of Fleur de Rêve, which she said appears on the net as the only copy. It seems to be published in Cairo. So with that as well, like I wondered if people could speak to kind of the availability and of current, you know, I saw that Layla and Chloe both had different sort of editions of Musings. The availability of and the sort of how it moves around currently.
I mean, we're blessed in Kuwait with quite a few very well-stocked bookstores. We have a number of bookstores that have cropped up in Kuwait over the last, I don't know, decade or so, that have a real wide variety of works. And so most of my May Ziadeh texts have all come from here. And kind of all of the big ones, the biography by Salma Hafar al-Khuzberi, and you know, May's own writings and letters and things like that. So yeah, pretty well stocked over here.
Yeah, I think it's similar to me. I got most of the books of Ziadeh like 5 or 6 years ago from Beirut. But I also came across like an original copy of Sawaneh Fatat at the University Library here at Cambridge. So, you know, there are sources here and there. But I think a lot of her writing is also digitalized. So if you look at الأعمال المجهولة لمي زيادة, collected by Joseph Zaidan, if we look at Salma Hafar al-Kuzbari's, these are all also available online. Now, for the question about Fleur de Rêve, I think the version I use is also the copy one online. Although I have to say some of these poems have been translated during Ziadeh's lifetime into Arabic, and they're available on Al-Sharikh archives if someone is interested in that. But we should ask Rose which version she uses of Fleur de Rêve at some point.
Yeah, so Chloe, tell us where did you come across yours?
Yeah, you know, accessing Arabic literature based in Montreal, where there is a huge actually readership, I would say, and there's an Arabic book fair going on right now in Quebec as well. But and that happens every year, both in Ontario and Quebec. But yeah, in general, if you're not affiliated with an institution, it's really difficult to get affordable access to affordable Arabic literature, and that's obviously the same in the U.S. as well. This is the 1989 printing from Dar Naufel in Cairo. And I was given a big stack of May Ziadeh's books by a mentor, Bill Granara at Harvard, who also a scholar of Arabic literature, who passed on to me probably a dozen of her books. So the informal economy of circulation, but I'm really happy to have it. Yeah.
And in terms of sort of the engagement with May Ziadeh's ideas and words today in Arabic. So back to you, maybe Layla to start, or Dana. What place do you feel she has in the, in the literary canon, from in the landscape of what literature that is taken seriously from her period? Like, would I assign her today if I were teaching a course?
I would. But it's interesting because, for me, like a lot of my awareness of different Arab women writers comes from different Arab women writers. And so, like I mentioned, where I read Nawal Saadawi's book, which is from the late 70s. And, already there's some like mistakes, I guess you could say, that I later realized that they were mistakes because then I went down this May Ziadeh rabbit hole and started reading lots of other things. But that's kind of where is that intertextuality of Arab women writers writing about other Arab women writers. And so in that regard, I haven't seen her mentioned that much, to be honest, she's kind of forgotten by later Arab women writers, I think, in the sense that I don't remember, really coming across any sort of deep, critical engagement with her work by later Arab women writers. I mean, I don't know, that might just be, my reading or reflective of my reading, but I think she has, for the most part, been kind of reduced and simplified and forgotten by Arab writers as well. I mean, like I said, the idea that Nawal can only find that to say about her is quite shocking. So I mean, I don't know what others think.
Go ahead, just jump in, Chloe.
Okay, great. No, I was just going to say, I mean, it's in a slightly different but related, track. I think I would really hope that we could also incorporate her more into the history classroom as well as sort of in her literary context, because as I alluded to in my remarks, I think that this is honestly also such a valuable text, or these essays are such valuable texts for understanding, the time period in which she lived, and she is so engaged with current events. And so, I haven't previously taught her in classes, but I certainly would now, and having thought so much more now about these works in their context. And so maybe that's something those of us who are kind of in both worlds can try to also promote as well.
Dana, can you talk maybe a little bit about whether there have been sort of what kinds of serious engagements there have been by other Arab women writers since then with May?
Yeah. I think my impression is very close to Layla's, right? Like she appears in Nawal Saadawi, but also in a very reductive manner and reductive lens. But I've seen her name make a brief appearance in Traces of Anayat in the last chapter, where she talks about this collective of Arab women and cutting their hair. And obviously, May Ziadeh is there with Aisha Taimur and other women. I think I've also, I mean, the thing is, she is mentioned, but you really have to trace these connections and intertextualities because Fadwa Tuqan acknowledges her in her memoir. We also have Jamila Al-Alayli, who's a member of the Apollo group, also saying that Ziadeh's poetry has influenced hers, which comes later in the 1930s and 1940s. But it's not the kind of connection that you would come across, right? So I think that's also the beauty of working with Ziadeh and tracing her literary connections because she is there. But again, you have to go beyond those sensationalized narratives about her love stories and her madness and her melancholy to find these actual connections.
I mean, I think, I think we can't maybe, ignore her institutionalization since that's like also an important part of what it means. I personally just can't like help thinking about Britney Spears in this context. Like it is still like it's still a thing that happens. People have their, it's people are institutionalized without their will. Um, uh, and this is, an important aspect. I don't want to like say that it didn't happen to her, but then
Of course, I mean, it's the elephant in the room, right? So we have to address it. But my problem is it really overshadowed her intellectual legacy for so long. It's just this period of a year and a couple of months that then makes the most appearance of May Ziadeh when you research May Ziadeh in Arabic or, when someone says, yeah, I know May Ziadeh, isn't she the woman who went to Asforia? And I'm like, well, she's so much more than that. So
right.
yeah, as you
Well,
said, it is a very important, period that happened in her life, but then it overshadowed all the intellectual legacy and all her writings that have happened for longer period than that. Yeah.
mm, yeah, and I mean, yeah, would it be how I would want to be remembered? No, I
Right.
would want people to be engaging with my work, not with, this fight, this fight that I had for my dignity. But so Marilyn,
Yeah.
what can you? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Layla. You were
No,
going to.
no, no, no. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize my mic was on.
Oh, okay. I wondered if you could tell us anything about later engagement with Maya's work that you've come across.
Yeah, it's interesting. Whenever I'm in Paris, I go to several feminist bookstores, and in my most recent trip, I was really fascinated to see a couple of things written on May Ziadeh. But although I think more biographical than actually sort of critical works. I mean, the other thing I would say about this, I agree with, everything that's been said. I think there also is a certain kind of way in which discourses around gender activism and feminism have followed a sort of maybe ironically national and nationalist trajectory. And so somebody like May Ziadeh, who had most of her adult career in Cairo, gets kind of, not completely, but gets kind of dropped out of the Egyptian narrative. And yet, because she's not in Lebanon, she gets somewhat dropped out there. And I don't want to say she's completely, obviously she's not completely erased. She is recognized, but it's I mean, I've dealt with that more with my work on Zeynep Fawez. I think the same thing very much happened to her. Here's a Lebanese Shi'i woman who goes to Cairo, and yet she's very much recognized now. But if you look at the kind of the immediate post-World War I period and it's understandable, Egyptian nationalism and so forth, people like her kind of drop out of the picture. And I think maybe a bit of that happened with Ziadeh. But the other thing I would say, though, is that she was clearly being read. And one gauge that I would say about this is that, so back when I was a graduate student and then newly minted PhD, and I was in Cairo, I used to haunt secondhand bookstores and of course the Ezbekiya wall, the books, but also several booksellers. And luckily I bought a lot of books, and I among those were May Ziadeh's works. So, I have originals of pretty much everything she wrote, except not Fleur de Rêve, but, the Arabic. And I think that just might suggest that those works were around, they were circulating. And of course, she was published by Al-Muqtataf Press, and they were, quite a major operation. So I think, people were reading her. One of my most precious, I'm not sure, I think it is in my copy of Soana Fatet, is that I have a couple of readers' comments, and that sort of somebody writing in the margins. And there's one that I like to think is from a young woman reader, and she just says, "Sadaqti ya May." In other words, you got it right, and with an exclamation point. And I just love that because, that's a kind of communication. We're not often party to those kinds of exchanges. So that's really good. But I think she was clearly being read and noticed.
So as we've kind of spilled over our hour of time, I wanted to talk a little bit about the future of engagement with May Ziadeh and May Ziadeh's work. Marilyn had already mentioned wishing to see more translations. Then but I wanted to start with you to talk about where do you see future areas of sort of exploration, thinking with and around May's work?
Well, I think I second Marilyn. It's definitely, good to see more translations of May Ziadeh coming, and I think that also ensures more engagement with her work. But I'd also like to see more critical engagement with her literature. So working with, as we said, this multifaceted voice. Many aspects of her voice can be read, whether it's like in the political realm, in her opinions about marriage, and her decision not to engage with certain debates, for example, about the veil and Qasim Amin and Malak Hifni Nasif. So, questions of where does she draw the line, given her positionality as a Christian Lebanese immigrant in Cairo circles. So I think giving attention to that, but also to the agency that she still gained and that she still wanted more women writers to engage with. I think, I'd like to just see more readings of May Ziadeh from different perspectives. And I'm glad that, again, this translation of Sawana Fatat is coming out, because I think it opens so many doors for this kind of engagement.
Chloe, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I said this earlier, but I see a lot of potential coming again from the historian's perspective for, as Dana said, also for this to travel into, what we teach and more, into critical historical engagements. Not that it's not there. She definitely is there and she's present, but, also beyond women's history. I think this is important too. Yes, she's a woman's voice, but she's commenting on so much outside of women's issues as sometimes they get framed, and so that's something that I hope that we can be a part of as well. And in terms of future translations, I think I hope that maybe this group or others can collaborate as well on bringing more of her work to light, that this is only the first.
Okay, so we have a bunch of questions, and I would like to address as many as possible. So one of them is that I think will be interesting broadly is, speaking of teaching and including in curricula, I'm interested in trying to include this project in a translation studies course, and I was wondering, from your perspective, what aspects of the project can help us best rethink translation as a process and as a product. And I guess Ibtihal, or Dana, or anybody who wants to think about, Michael also asks at some point, I think, why so many translators? And I guess maybe that's a question to me. Why so many translators? Why did we want to make this a collective project rather than, for instance, the Samir Azam translation was Rania who I think is here now, Abdurrahman, doing the translation with, forward, and of course some other people were involved. But whereas this was a much more expansive project, bringing together a wide range of translators and editors, all of whom happen to be women, or maybe not happen to be women. And I think, to me, this sort of the collective part of this, the collective recovery, the collective address to this sort of salon aspect to her work, the discussion, the conversation was such an important aspect of her work, and also the desire to bring all these different perspectives on her work to bear. So to me, that having a lot of people involved was an important aspect to this. I mean, obviously, we want to then, edit the collection as a whole and make sure that there's a voice to it to honor her work in that way. But having many people work on it in a collective way felt important to how we could do this work.
Yeah, if you just let me jump in very quickly. So in a way, I feel like the work that we do is kind of similar to the work of archaeologists. We're like uncovering some older works by women from a different era. And this is especially important because, so I remember one very infuriating incident in my journey when I was doing my thesis in grad school. Part of it was about Layla Saadawi, and every English resource that I consulted basically referred to her as the Simone de Beauvoir of the Arab world. I was very angry at that because I feel like, why do we have to get a representative of Arab feminism from a different civilization, a different culture? Like, we don't have our own representatives to represent our thought, our feminism. And here we have May Ziadeh, who was actually born 20 years before Simone de Beauvoir, who had already been writing and publishing prolifically with so much profundity and intellect. Why can't we use her instead? Why can't we talk about Layla Saadawi being the inheritant of May Ziadeh, for example, or something like that, something within those lines? So I feel like the work that we do is kind of like building a lineage, or like a genealogy of Arab feminism that we can refer to and use as representative examples of our own issues, our own struggles, our own history, and how we interacted with what was happening and our own concerns as Arab women at a certain time, instead of referring to Simone de Beauvoir. So that was one of the most important things to me that actually brought me on board with this project. So I just wanted to talk about that because I felt like it was an important part of doing this work, basically.
I would also say that it's just more enjoyable to work with a group, a collective on a project, than to work just a handful of people.
Well, I think as a follow-up to this question, there was another question that I could read out loud. I think Ibtihal and Marcia, you can address it best. It's about the editorial process, and how does the editorial process go to bring all the slightly different shades of voices produced into a coherent voice that brings back an interlocutor, as you've described her. And I think that's something that I thought about when I was turning my translations, because it's me, but it's also a lot of other translators. So how did you deal with this slightly different voice into a new language?
Yeah, I think this is important because, I mean, for myself, I guess one of the major things that I've done with my life is editing translations of Arabic literature. So I edit a lot of translations, and some translators. I've edited more than a dozen of their translations. And some, I would say, sometimes there are translators who have a particular tics and a particular, they bring the same things to bear on every, ideally, the translator is engaging with the work, and trying to translate the entire experience of that work into a new language, rebuilding it from scratch every single time. In reality, I find, yes, you often find the translator bringing their particular tics about language to every single translation that they do. I do think that in that sense, having a collective translation in some ways helps us see those things differently, see the original, the nature of the translation, the people who are bringing to bear their view on my, and then not just trying to flatten all of it, but to try to reckon with it, to consider what it means that each translator is bringing themselves to this project. So obviously we want to have a style, and we want the reader a consistent style guide, and we want the reader to have a consistent experience. But I think it's important that we not ignore the fact that the translator is bringing themselves here to this project.
Yeah, and one interesting thing about this project in particular is that we actually do have several pieces that were translated by multiple translators. Like, for example, the ones that are included in Marilyn's introduction in her own translation were also translated by another translator later on in the book. So I think that it would be interesting for readers to see how different translators approach the same text and interpret it differently. So I don't know if Marilyn has anything to say about that. Like, how did you feel about your translations being retranslated by other translators?
Well, I feel absolutely fine about somebody else translating the text, but I have to say that, yeah, this was as you remember, there was an issue of just time and crush of things. I think there are a few little excerpts in my piece, not the separate translations, but in my piece that were older translations I did. So yeah, they're my translations, but they're also me translating them, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years ago. So I would, translate them a bit differently now. I just couldn't kind of manage that at this point. But I did, as I said earlier, I mean, I did change, the ones that I translated as separate pieces for the volume. They're not the same as when I translated them a number of years ago. So translation, it's not just about different people, but it's about the same translator at a different point in her trajectory or her career. I've said before, I always have a hard time reading my translations after they've been published because I can always see something that I would do differently. I mean, it's just, it's never over. So.
Well, and language is, of course, always changing too. So the way in which you might address your audience is different from how it might have been 20 years ago too. Okay, well, we've, I think, filled our time. I'm so grateful to everyone for participating in this first ever of our May Ziadeh literary salons. Around this book that is coming in October, and that people can also sign up to receive in their inbox week by week if they want. And we will have information about that in the links. And we really are so appreciative of everybody for coming today, and for everybody who will be watching later, and most especially to everybody who's participated and is participating in bringing this book into a new language. Thanks everybody so much.